This is our third video of 5 in the set of slides explaining the MacroSim economic simulation models. This series of videos is brought to you by Linux Mint. No, it's not brought to you by Linux Mint. I'm just recommending to Harvey Mudd students that you get a hold of your life and discover free and open source software and discover the Linux operating system. I do recommend Linux Mint or possibly Ubuntu 18.04 long-term stable as where you start if you're unfamiliar with the operating system. In the past two videos, we first discussed the relevance of the MacroSim 1 model, looked at its derivation mathematically, talked about the concept of the multiplier, which was an important takeaway of the model, ran a simulation or two, and then discussed the limitations of the model. One of those limitations was that they do not include a financial sector in that model. And so in 2 steps, we're going to add that. This is the first of those 2 steps. We are introducing the loanable funds model to the MacroSim structure by first developing it independently as a standalone model, which is easy to do, and that's in this video set, and then adding it to the MacroSim 1 to turn it into MacroSim 2. Now you may remember, I hope, the loanable funds model. I should have been using this pointer, by the way, in the previous 2 videos. I forgot to do that. Remember, it has a supply of funds line that is, in the context of this model, is going to be equal to savings line plus an arbitrary increase in the money supply or credit supply, as we used it in the comparative statics version of the model. And we have a demand for funds line. And in the context of this model, we're going to say the demand for funds in this elementary assumption we're making here consists of investment plus the budget deficit run by the government. And investment is a negative function of the interest rate. That is to say, if there is no deficit, this blue line that slopes down is in fact the investment function all by itself. If there's a deficit, it tends to push this line outward, as is shown right here. Supply of funds line, of course, depends upon savings attitudes of businesses and consumers. It can be adjusted outward by the Federal Reserve System when they increase the money supply, as was the case when we used the models in their graphical format. Now, these are the equations that allow us to construct it. They start at 5 because these equations are actually taken from MacroSim 2, and so you'll see them again when we get to MacroSim 2. So we're saying here that the demand for funds is equal to investment, a function of the interest rate, plus the deficit. The supply of funds is equal to savings plus any increase in the money supply, and that the supply of funds is equal to the demand for funds in identity. Also, the change in the money supply is equal to the money supply growth rate that we assume times the existing money supply. And this equation 8 is necessarily because the autonomous variable that we tweak to affect this model is not the change in the money supply or the change in credit. It's the money supply growth rate, which actually is potentially the policy variable that is targeted by the Federal Reserve System. Then again, we have the investment equation, which is now in this model endogenous. It's a negative function of the interest rate, and that's what that minus D means. It should be perhaps plus, and then we say that D would always be negative, I guess. And in other words, the negatively sloped investment function shown right here, and the positively sloped savings function shown right here. So that's what this model looks like. Fairly simple and easy to simulate. It's identical basically to the comparative statics model, except that it's somewhat simplified. And then this is it in Python. And so down here are the equations and the structure that we've figured out. This includes a solution built into this, which I don't show because it's very difficult to show. It's algebraically determined in a whole series of steps, but this is what it ends up being. And these are going to be our starting assumptions and our policy inputs. You can see we got the money supply growth rate as a realistic percentage growth rate of 5%. And in the case of this model, because it's a piece of a larger model. The deficit is autonomous, but when we add this to the MacroSim 1 to make MacroSim 2, that's no longer true. So we are no longer assuming that investment is a certain level, and you're not assuming an interest rate either. Both are being solved by this model, which is what we want. So if we add the assumptions, here this is the output, the investment intercept, the investment slope, savings intercept, savings slope, those are all assumed, and they're assumed at values that I experimented with to make the default for this model when we add it to MacroSim 2 the same as the default for MacroSim 1. That's why these assumptions are these values. And again, it's entirely arbitrary as to what you put in here. The investment slope minus 4,500, that doesn't mean anything at all, really. It's just what you have to get to the similar solution. Again, the policy variables and the simulation results. And now we have something that I'm going to explain in a later slide. We have supply or savings, elasticities and investment elasticities that we can estimate in this model. So we're set up to use this model. We're not going to dwell here for very long. This is a short slide set because our primary interest is adding this model to MacroSim 1 to make MacroSim 2. Now, let's try to remember a concept from the book, though, that we had before coming to these simulation models on crowding out. The lectures I gave on the loanable funds model did not discuss crowding out, but the book chapter about the loanable funds model did. And I showed it with this figure 3.4 from that chapter. Let's read what it says at the bottom, and that's an extract from the chapter itself. We say the effect of budget deficits upon interest rates introduces the possibility of an economic phenomenon called crowding out. Economic theory tells us that if interest rates are rising because of budget deficits, then the demand for funds in the private sector, corporate, consumer, and mortgage borrowing might fall because of these higher interest rates. So that was discussed in the book, but was not discussed in the lecture because I knew I was going to discuss it at this point. Now, first of all, let's assume for the moment that this demand for funds line right here, it actually is being called the demand for credit line in the book, which is actually a better term, is entirely the investment line only, because let's assume we're not running a budget deficit at DC1. So this blue line at equilibrium E1 actually represents investment solo, because let's assume the budget deficit is 0. Then we do something to increase the budget deficit, and that moves the demand for credit out from DC1 to DC2. It produces a new market clearing equilibrium interest rate, E1 to E2, and it raises the interest rate from R1 to R2. Now, to show the effect of crowding out that results from running this deficit, again, DC1 is assuming no deficit, DC2, demand for credit 2, shows the effect of the deficit. We want to introduce a new component of the slide. This right here, I1, represents the level of investment that was to be found at R1, because remember, we're saying DC1 by assumption is only the investment function, which is negatively sloped in interest rates. We're saying that when the budget deficit increases the demand for credit or the demand for funds from DC1 to DC2 and produces a higher interest rate, the total equilibrium demand and supply of funds is at E2. However, we're interested in what effect this had upon investment only. So if we go back to the original demand for credit 1 line, where we said that's assumed to be investment only, we can see that at this higher interest rate, we get this level of investment right here, represented by the dotted black line, and that is a lower level of investment than we had at our initial equilibrium. That's the phenomenon of crowding out, as at least a logical possibility. So again, what it is saying is that if you run a large budget deficit and it's not offset by anything else in the economy, then this is going to push up interest rates, and it will have a tendency to crowd out private borrowing because of the higher interest rates. So then, of course, in the chapter on loanable funds, we said there can be an offsetting policy, and that's shown right here. If you combine budget deficits and open market operations, as we did in the lecture on loanable funds, and have therefore an increase in the supply of credit, as is shown here from SC1 to SC2, due to Federal Reserve open market operations, that can bring the interest rate back down. But it clearly will do so at a much, much higher volume of realized credit. That is to say, the credit growth rate is going to be quite high if we do that. So we saw that in the loanable funds model, and we want to mimic that in the loanable funds application to MacroSim 2. So let's move ahead and try to do that. Okay, so here's the crowding out in the loanable funds model. And if you go back and look at MacroSim 1, which you don't really need to do, you'll see that the simulation results are the same as we got in MacroSim 1. So I set up the default intercepts for the investment and slope for the investment and the like, such that it produced the equilibrium level of GDP. But here, this is only the loanable funds part, so that actually shows up only in MacroSim 2. Here we have, this is why the investment intercept and slope and savings intercept and slope, again, are as they are here, because I want to use this to generate the initial default equilibrium as the same as it was in MacroSim 1. So here the policy variables are the growth rate and the budget deficit. In this version of the model, the budget deficit is autonomous. Here we have our assumptions about the elasticities by default of investment and savings. And down here we have the simulation results in the context of the loanable funds model, where we get investment at 420, which is what it was in MacroSim 1. So this model solves out, and it gives us the savings and investment elasticities as a byproduct that we'll talk about later. Now, I realize if you're looking at this video, you may not know what those terms mean because they're common to microeconomic theory and not macroeconomic theory. And so I'll explain it a little bit later. I don't hold you accountable for it because you may not have the background to understand it. If you do understand elasticities, then you know the difference between inelastic and elastic, and we're showing here that that can have a big impact upon the final solution value for this model. Okay, so let's increase the budget deficit as we did right here. It was originally 40, now it's 60. And we can see that investment falls back because the interest rate rose. So the interest rate rises from 4% exactly to 4.19%. That effect upon investment is to pull it back. And that's what we're referring to as crowding out. Investment was crowded out by nearly $9 in the context of this. The large deficit raises interest rates by 19 basis points, which crowds out 9.6 units of investment. And so we can, however, offset this, as we know, because of the original application of the model, with money supply growth. Now here, we are not looking at the default of the loanable funds model. This is the result of the last simulation. We're going to continue working with that. So here we have already increased the budget deficit to 60. So this is not the default. The default was budget deficit of 40. And here, of course, we have the lower investment rate at the higher interest rate. So we ask, is there some kind of panacea to solve this crowding out problem? And you know the answer is a qualified yes. Let's increase the money supply growth rate. And so we do that. Originally it was 5%. Now it's the sign of the beast, 6.66%. And the budget deficit remains at 60. But by increasing the money supply growth rate from 5% to 6.6% or 6.7%, we have actually brought the interest rate back down to 4, and we have raised investment back up to 2.0. And that's the sort of E1 equals E2 solution that we had in our comparative statics version of this model. And so this loanable funds model in the next slide set will be added to MacroSim 1, and the result we will call MacroSim 2. So that's it for this. Let's take a brief pause here, and then let's look at the combination of MacroSim 1 and MacroSim 2.